Hey everyone, this is Louis7 and another episode of LOTRO Basics, and in this episode I will be doing a leveling build for Redline Rune Keeper, and I actually need to respec it right here. So this is going to be another one of those in-depth ones, and I know after I did the Yellow Line Rune Keeper I got a few requests for the Red Line because that's the more popular spec right now, and the Red Line's also good for leveling. The Yellow Line is good, but the Red Line's also good and generally actually does more damage, but sometimes while leveling and towards the lower levels, Yellow Line can just be better. But especially at high levels, you'll notice the Red Line doing more damage and just generally stronger, less mobile. But that's just a comparison of those two. So when you spec into the Red Line, for the first time you get Smoldering Wrath, which is an attunement consumer. It's a channeled skill that is really strong. It does a lot of damage every second, and for the full channel duration it will deal that damage every second, and its durations increase per battle attunement you have, and that's just a strong cooldown skill to get early on. Another skill we get is actually a pretty strong active skill with a short cooldown is Rid of Fire. Rid of Fire is mainly wanted for the dot, its short cast and quick attunement building. And this also does increase damage per tier, the dot, and the dot applies up to 3 times, and it does decent amount of damage like I said. And then you also have a passive Searing Words that fire skills have a 20% chance to do a little bit of initial damage, but the main portion of that is another decent damage dot, about 2500 fire damage every 2 seconds for 6 seconds, and that can stack. You can have multiple Searing Words, and that's just a very strong chance, a chance to apply a very strong dot. At low levels, I notice on my Rune Keeper that if I ever get Searing Words, mobs seem to die a whole lot faster compared to if it doesn't happen at all. So we'll go ahead and spec into the Red Line. You see we got these 2 extra skills, Rid of Fire and Smoldering Wrath. At higher levels you get Distracting Flame, and that's way over here at 9 on my. So in the first row of traits we can get increased tactical damage. That'll actually be good. It's a flat up to 5% damage increase for all of our skills really. We could get up to 15% increased damage for a single skill, which is Fiery Ridicule, and at the max rank it'll make Fiery Ridicule an AoE for 3 targets. Fiery Ridicule is actually a strong skill. It's quite underrated in my opinion. Most people seem to ignore it being a quick cast, quick cooldown. Even though it builds low attunement, can be a decent dot and up to AoE if we got that to rank 5. And the last trait in this row is more of a survival trait, and it adds a heal and power cost reduction to self-motivation. The initial getting that to heal is actually very useful, especially if you're having trouble surviving. So at any point if you're noticing you're having trouble surviving, it might be worth just putting 1 point in that before moving on. But for the purposes of this build, we'll go ahead and get tactical damage because that affects everything, and compared to 15% of one skill versus 5% on every skill, it's more useful. In the first row we will get 20% Wrath of Flame damage, and Wrath of Flame damage is just a fancy name for all of our fire skills. So that's a 20% fire damage boost essentially, which is very strong damage boost actually, and just nice to have. And at low levels you might notice an increase of damage once you get that, but overall at that level you'll notice more increases from leveling up and getting a lot better gear pieces. So in the next row we can get fire skills, increase the fire damage of the Rune Keeper, and that can stack up to 5 times. So the effect stacks up to 5 times, and the effect amount is 1% to 5%, and it lasts 10 seconds. So if you use a bunch of fire skills in a row like you will in pretty much any fight, you can get up to 5 stacks of the fire damage buff, and at rank 5 that would be 5% per stack, which would be 25% total damage increase. And the duration would last 10 seconds, but each time you use a fire skill after that, it will just increase the duration back to 10 seconds and reset it. So that will be something useful, and it takes a little bit to build up. Not maybe the most exciting thing for a low level where stuff is dying faster and you won't really build that up too often. Or we could get this active skill, and like every other class and every other spec, you pretty much always want one of those, and this one's not an exception. And this one's just it has a kind of long induction and does build 3 attunement, but it's a pretty strong initial damage, which is unusual for a Fire Rune Keeper. And later on we'll actually make it an AoE and more useful than it is once you get it, but it's still good to get right away because of its strong damage, and you can use it to pull, and it's just an overall strong skill that can sometimes even one-shot mobs at lower levels. So that'll be good to get. So the rest of our 4 points, again, it's going to be more useful to increase the damage of everything than just the one skill from Fire Ridicule. And this is a useful set bonus we get in that Red of Fire tears down instead of dispelling upon expiration. So if you have that at tier 3, when the 20 seconds is over, it'll go down to tier 2 and then down to tier 1. And then it'll finally expel if you don't reapply Red of Fire and get its tier back up. So that'll just help you keep that up just in case you don't apply up to tier 3 again before it would dispel. Now it would just go down to tier 2, so that definitely helps in that situation. So while leveling and pretty much anything solo, I definitely recommend runestones. I know not everybody likes them, and for endgame they aren't the most useful for DPS, but our next trait in this line is our Fire Runestone, which does quite significant damage right at your feet where you place it, especially at low levels. At higher levels it doesn't scale quite as well at damage, but can still be useful for aggro, and it doesn't do like very bad damage. And it lasts 11 seconds and will keep dealing damage over time during that duration. It is definitely useful to get, but let's go ahead and check out the next trait. This one just increases the damage of Essence of Flame by up to 30%. Similar to Fire Ridicule, that only affects one skill and may not be the most worthy of getting. So we'll get the Runestone, but if you notice when we put 3 points in Explosive Rhetoric, we unlock Linnet of Flame, which increases the Essence of Flame max targets, which is actually very useful because that makes Essence of Flame a strong AoE skill and actually becomes in most situations our strongest AoE skill once we get that. So we'll go ahead and put 1 point in Linnet of Flame to finish out that line and unlock the next set bonus. And this set bonus reduces the cooldown of Smoldering Wrath, definitely nice. It makes the skill immune to interrupt, also nice, especially if you're solo leveling where you could easily get interrupted while channeling it. So that's just a nice buff to actually our strongest overall skill. So in the next row we can increase Volcanic Runestone damage, probably not the best option compared to some other stuff we have and even stuff in the earlier row. Increase Physical Mitigation, that'd be nice for some survival buff or boost, but not the most exciting thing, especially if you aren't having any trouble surviving, which you probably won't be, at least I wasn't when I was leveling a recent Rune Keeper around the level you'd be around here, which would be about in your level 30s, maybe mid 30s to low 30s, depending how many extra trait points you got from deeds at this point. And here's another survival skill that synergizes with this top right trait, and it's another self-motivation affecting one that it reduces the cooldown up to 15 seconds, and at the max rank it'll actually make it no induction and can be used while moving. Getting the third point in that is very useful. The first two are less useful, and it's especially useful when you at least get one rank in Overflowing Confidence. And the other trait in this row is Fire Skills reduce the armor of the target. It's definitely useful. So this will reduce 5% target armor rating per point you put in it, so up to 15%. It is useful, but overall there's actually more useful stuff earlier on. I would go ahead and get 1 point in Linnet of Flame to finish that out, 1 point in Tail of Rage. And now this is a point where if you really want survival, you could get 1 point in Overflowing Confidence and 3 points in Hasten Determination. But that's only if you are having trouble surviving. Otherwise, I would recommend going ahead and getting Molten Flame. And getting all 3 points of that will unlock the next row and set bonus. And this set bonus is very useful because it gives you an active skill that is a very strong active skill. It's got a little bit long induction at 2.5 seconds, but always worth casting. And it gives you 3 attunement. So this is a strong skill and it has a strong dot with it, but its actual most useful aspect is that it makes your next fire skill have no induction. So you could use Essay of Fire and then Essence of Flame for some high burst damage. That would be about 10k just from those two, assuming no crits in with my numbers, and that's not factoring in enemy mitigation or things like that. But it is a significant amount of damage and a very strong skill once you get it. You want to usually pull with it and use it on cooldown if you don't have anything like Smoldering Wrath, which might be more useful to use. So that'll be very nice once you get that, and again, this is around level in your 40s. So in this row, we can get fire skills have a chance to briefly reduce the target's resistance to fire. So each skill will have a 30% chance to go 5% fire mitigation per rank of the trait we get, up to 15% fire mitigation, So the chance doesn't change, but the amount of fire mitigation does. This is actually very useful, and is another thing that you have to build up towards, kind of like Molten Flame and Tail of Rage, and this is just stuff after you're in combat for a while. It will help, so if you are doing some instances while leveling or other group content where mobs aren't dying as fast, your damage will slowly be ramping up to be very high, and it's still very high to begin with. But generally, while leveling against regular mobs, you probably won't notice enough of an effect from all this stuff, because it does take a while to build up. So we can also get the skill Scathing Mockery, which the skill isn't great. It has a nice animation, nice effect, but it's just not the best skill. The damage isn't too great. It's decent up to 2000 with my numbers. And the dot is... the numbers of it are okay, but it only does it every 6 seconds and lasts 30 seconds, so that's also okay. The overall dot damage isn't too much. It's almost about 5000, a little bit more. Compare that to Essence of Flame, which does about the same amount of damage instantly. But one thing of it is it's max 5 targets. Another problem with it is it has a 3-second induction, so you'd pretty much only want to use that if we took it after using Essay of Fire, and Essay of Fire is also good to use right before Essence of Flame. So it's kind of a trade-off if you're facing enough enemies where you think it's worth using or getting Scathing Mockery even, and if you're in fights long enough where the dot can actually take effect and be more useful than using another skill, like even Fiery Ridicule can be better sometimes than using Scathing Mockery in some smaller target AoE situations. So I'd still go ahead and get 1 point in Scathing Mockery, and so at this point you'll notice that the Empowering Flames actually is linked, it might be a bit hard to see, to Mystifying Flames, and this one's still useful, so we'll go ahead and get all 3 points on that. And to get the last point we need, we can go ahead and get Conflagration of Runes just to start that, and we will want to get this to max ranks to make Fire Ridicule even more useful. So this set bonus is Fire of Skills, place a stacking buff on the Rune Keeper, and at 5 stacks, this buff will make the next writ have no induction, and it will heal some of your morale, so it's a nice thing that can heal you a little bit, but also the no induction of the writ, and it'll glow a little bit around the skill in the border when you have that buff and at 5 stacks, so you know Rid of Fire's instant cast. So that's definitely something nice, and to keep in mind that you will have an instant cast Rid of Fire, because it's just something useful to have instant cast like that and know not to cast Rid of Fire after Essay of Fire if that's instant cast. You usually don't want to use Rid of Fire after that anyway. But just something to know and a useful set bonus overall. So in this row we can get increased fire damage over time, so plus 25% up to increased dot damage, and a lot of our damage is dot based, as you probably noticed. Even Smoldering Wrath probably counts as a dot. And then Mystifying Flames now briefly reduce induction, so while Mystifying Flames, whenever you trigger Mystifying Flames, which is a 30% chance to trigger, you can reduce the inductions by 10% for 8 seconds and up to 30% at rank 3. That's very useful because whenever that triggers, you'll just be casting faster and can cast more skills and do more damage. And overall, increases your speed, and to me, that increases the amount of fun. So at this point, I think it's good to go ahead and get 1 point in that just to make sure you can trigger it and really compare to anything else. And at that point, I'd go ahead and get up to 20% increased fire damage over time from this trait, which will unlock the next set bonus in row. And this set bonus is Searing Words, that passive we got from entering into the spec. The damage of it is increased by 10% for each tier of Rid of Fire on the target, so up to 30%. And then it just basically restates Searing Words, which is the 20% chance to do the tiny bit of damage initially, and decent dot over 6 seconds. So in the next row we can get an active skill called Combustion. This will be our other only fire attunement consumer, and this one will return you all the way to neutral attunement. But this is an AoE with a short induction that does a decent amount of damage to the target, and then deals even more damage to all enemies within 5 meters, including the target you have. It'll deal the AoE damage and damage them twice. Overall, it's actually a strong skill, even though Scathing Mockery, Smoldering Wrath actually is a lot better in pretty much any single target situation, but when you have excess attunement and can build attunement back to Smoldering Wrath quick enough, that's always worth using. So, if you can't tell, we will get that trait, but let's go ahead and look at the next trait just in case it's better. So this one just increases the pulse of all Wrath of Fire damage over time effects, so they last longer. So something like Scathing Mockery, that actually really helps, because that'll get 2 more pulses and you won't have to worry about refreshing it as often if you're using it in a long fight for the dot and AoE. Even though those situations are pretty rare, it could happen, and something to keep in mind. So I'd go ahead and get 1 point in Combustion and then 1 point in the skill pulses, and this actually really helps with something like Essay of Fire, which doesn't have many pulses. Increasing that by 2 is another almost about 6,000 damage on average with my numbers, and Searing Words is about 5,000 damage. So that will actually be very useful and help our damage a lot. So at this point we are done with the fire side, at least from what we can progress further down, and we'll go back and fill some stuff in. But I'll go ahead and cover the next set bonus. So this gives you some bonuses to your fire skills. So Seething Truth for Combustion, it spreads the current tier of Rid of Fire to all enemies hit. So if you have tier 3 Rid of Fire and use Combustion, on top of all the damage, it'll spread the debuff, which is definitely useful. And this just increases Smoldering Wrath damage by 30%. Again, Smoldering Wrath is very strong, and our strongest skill, really. And then Essay of Fire's initial damage is increased by 30%, so that would be about 1 to 2,000 damage with my numbers. So definitely helpful, and just overall a good various set bonus to get. So to backtrack some traits we'd want in the blue line, there's not too much that might be that useful compared to some of the stuff we can get in red line, and similar with the yellow line. So we'll go ahead and backfill with the red line. I would go ahead and get 1 more point in the fire damage over time to cap that off, and then 2 more ranks in this to increase the induction reduction amount. And then I would get 4 points in fire ridicule damage. Now, my preference would be to go ahead and get Ace in Determination and 1 point in Overflowing Confidence. But if you really don't think you need any of the survivability or mobility that provides, you could go down into the yellow line, and I would recommend getting the critical chance from Cutting Remarks. That would be your first goal after filling out everything you want in the red line. And then actually after that, in the yellow line, you could get the Lightning Runestone, because that can be useful for the stun and just the CC aspects of it, especially solo and leveling. And actually when it comes to Mordor, once you get that high level, it could be very useful again to have those effects, even though some of the easier content from lower levels might not need it quite as much. But at that point you'd be nearing Mordor anyway. It really depends how many extra trait points you get on the way, because if you just level, you will have about 50 when entering Mordor, which is not much. And then in the blue line you could get some healing stuff, like Mending Verse is kind of useful if solo, just so you can quickly heal yourself some out of combat, quicker than just using Prelude to Hope, which isn't much. And in this you could also get Increased Flat Will, which isn't the most useful. And then you could get the Healing Runestone, which can be useful. But if you wanted to get the Healing Runestone, you would have to go through the Will, which would be the most useful compared to Evade Chance. Okay, so for the rest of my points in my build, I will go ahead and put 1 point in the Self-Motivation for the healing effect, and then 3 points to make it instant cast. And that is about all I need in the red line for my build and how I want it. So in the yellow line, I will get the Shocking Touch, Daze Duration, and Daze Damage. I mainly use that for the duration, so I can daze enemies for a while, so I can just ignore them if I pull too many. And then I'm going to go for the Tactical Critical Chance. And now that I have 2 points left over, I'll get the Lightning Runestone. And if I had 2 more points, I would get Mending Verse. But I think the Lightning Runestone is more useful than Mending Verse. And of note, LOTRO Trait Tree Planner is still down, so I can't show the rest of the build or theoretical build. But from this point on, I would get Mending Verse, and then 4 points in Will, and then Rune of Restoration. That would give me about maybe 5 more trait points total to spend, which I could spend on increasing Runestone damage, self-motivation heal, and power cost reduction, or just physical mitigation. But I am happy with this build, and this is my red line build. Fortunately, some of my skills got out of order here. So I am a Mordor landscape. I try to go somewhere good where I could show some variety of gameplay. Unfortunately, I just recently leveled up, and actually did that doing a featured instance, so I was already here when I was level 107, when this would have been a little bit more on level. But this is still a decent place. Okay, so I open with Essay of Fire, use Essence of Flame, and this actually reminds me, I have a gameplay guide for the red line, which I can link in the comments. And it will be pretty much a red line very similar to this. I think there are a few differences I might have in that specific build I used during that video, but the whole gameplay guide would be the same. But anyway, this is just to show some gameplay and how this build actually plays. And this is at the level cap, so if you're leveling in low level, the gameplay will be different because you won't have all the stuff we got yet in these traits. But this is what you can look forward to as well. And here I can use the lightning runestone to stun him, even though it's not the most useful in this situation. So when I went through here the first time, there were a lot more mobs in this area. So I'm going to go to a slightly different area just so I can show some better gameplay real quick. Alright, so I'm pretty much using the same thing. Going to try and burn this guy real quick. Another problem with Mordor is finesse. I'm getting resisted a lot. And that probably won't be happening quite as much while leveling, as much as I'm getting resisted. Here I accidentally pulled some extra mobs. This is a useful time for the lightning runestone when I can daze them. And here's when I'd wait for Smoldering Wrath to use that. And I can just burn that one mob real quick because it does a lot of damage. Fortunately, I also pulled the signature here, even though I want to pull him, just not quite yet. So I'm going to daze him with Shocking Touch. Good thing I got the increased duration because I'll need that. And he got up too quickly, it looks like. So I need to use something to remove all my attunement so I can heal. I could actually use Steady Hands, because I really need some morale. Okay, so I'm going to use the stun from Shocking Words, self-motivation, quick heal. Alright, now I should be able to attack him a bit. Now I'm going to use Shocking Touch to daze him again. Unfortunately, this actually does show a little bit of how Rune Keeper can be good gameplay. Or how the red line cannot be quite ideal in all situations compared to yellow line where I could just kite him out much more efficiently, but when I actually did deal damage to him, I did a lot of damage. I just needed to survive that particular situation. But anyway, hopefully this is showing you how red line plays in this build and the use of the 2 rune stones. Which I don't use those every fight because the typical rotation doesn't really need it and the typical mob doesn't need it. Okay, so I will just kill a couple more, probably this camp, and that will be it for this gameplay section. So I'm going to let the runestones kill him while I pull an extra mob. My health is actually getting a little bit low. I don't want to pull both archers. And that ended up being okay. And I have a very full inventory I will need to organize, but at a later time. So that will be it for this episode of LOTRO Basics. I hope you all learned something useful and enjoyed, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, and thanks for watching.